I think it's a very pertinent topic that we want to address today, and we have an amazing panelist that's going to lead us into the conversation. Just a couple of house rules. We were hoping that we were a bit more audience or attendance, so we'll see how the people pick up. So what we set up the webinar is to mute the attendees, but we have the facility to unmute if there's any questions, which we will do. At the back end, we've got Jacob and Liza that will administrate that. Then if I go to the buttons, we all know Zoom, so I think we're all familiar now with the Zoom. On the bottom of your screen, there is a chat and a questions that you can post. And then as we go along is that Jacob and Lisa and the panelists will share their screens with us if they talk. So when there's a PowerPoint presentation, they will show it on the screen, and then you can see them on the right-hand side of your screen. If there's not a PowerPoint presentation, then we'll put the panelists in the middle, and then you can see their faces as they talk. Now, what we've done also, and you can see the website on there, is www.WCO ESA Regional Private Sector Group.org. You can at any time go in there. We post new material, and we want to make sure that we keep the region up to breast of what's developing in the region. Now, I think you all will agree that COVID-19 have done a lot of things to us, but for me personally, there's 3 things that I learned. That is, I must have a positive mindset, and I must make sure that hope doesn't fly out of the window or out of the door, because if that's happened, I'm in trouble. And then the third point is that I must have a dream, and I must live the dream. And I think that's why we actually have a very nice panelist to tell us today how the dream of the African Union needs to look like, and how does the borders needs to look like, and what can we learn from them. So let us stop here, and then I'm going to go to Larry. I'm going to hand over to him. So he's the director of the regional capacity building for the ESA region, and we work under their control and their management. So over to you, Patrick. Larry, sorry for that, Larry.
Good morning, wherever you are, or afternoon, depending on your time zone. Thank you very much, Juanita, for having us here once again. We really appreciate you together with Jacob and the team, and we are honored that you are our partners in this. I'm going to ask Jacob to put up my presentation, if that's okay, or if you want me to share the screen from this side. I will let you know when to move, but as a background, ladies and gentlemen, I like providing a status update on what is happening in the region. And we are all familiar with the topic of smart borders and single windows, but specifically in light of the COVID-19, I just wanted to give this particular background that the East and Southern Africa region currently accounts for 50% of the COVID cases in Africa. Slightly more than 50% of the COVID cases in Africa, specifically to be precise, 53%. For a while, we accounted for less than 30%, but as the cases rose, especially in South Africa, we went up. And currently, South Africa in itself is accounting for, again, 53% of Africa's cases and 83% of the cases in East and Southern Africa. What we have noticed in the last couple of months was initially that the rate of increase in cases continued to go up by nearly 10% every week. And they got sustained to a higher level, up to 25% increase, 30% increase every week 2 months ago. And then a month ago, the rates of increase in COVID cases went down to 25% a week, and then went to 17% a week. And last week, the rate of increase in cases in East and Southern Africa went down by 15%. They are increasing, yes, but by 15% compared to, say, 40% 4 weeks ago. Regarding the deaths, we have also continued. Just go back to the homepage, please. We have also continued to have increases in deaths. Nevertheless, these have been down on a downward trend. The deaths have continued to increase, but the rates have gone on a downward trend. So at the moment, our deaths are at about 22% increase every week, down from 33% 3 weeks ago. And our recoveries have also maintained near the same trend, where we get about 30% of recoveries every week from the previous number. On to our next slide. I just wanted to briefly share what is happening in the region. We have observed a couple of things. Let's just, we just show the whole slide. I'm sorry for that. Yeah, thank you. We have observed a couple of things, many which are known to you, but these observations also happen to be challenges on our border posts. A lot of our member countries closed their borders for people, but maintained them open for cargo. So goods kept moving. However, we had a lot of challenges. For instance, between the South Africa and Zambia border, between the Zimbabwe-Zambia border, and different border posts, Tanzania, Kenya, where there were issues of delayed cargo delivery. We have been talking to the Juanita and team a lot about these challenges that have been experienced. And some of these challenges have included, say, drivers getting to the points of exit either without the COVID certificates, or changing requirements that are not communicated to the drivers on the other side, or what would just be called unnecessary bottlenecks to trade, as we have seen in other borders. We have also seen a reduction in customs revenue in the region, with virtually every member administration in the region reporting reduction in customs revenue. Aside from the previous projections, this has been from as low as 2% to as high as 20%. So customs accounts for nearly 30% of the revenue input for most revenue administrations in East and Southern Africa. So where you see a reduction of, and the other percentage taken by domestic taxes. So where you see such a percentage, a loss of about 30% in revenue, and yet goods are supposed to be moving, then there are a lot of things that are causing these. Number one, half the products that come into East and Southern Africa comes from the East, specifically China, and then places like Turkey. So April saw a higher reduction because a lot of production places in China were closed, and they began opening in May. So within 30 days, we have seen a slight increase, but it's a sustained increase in the goods that are coming in. The only challenges are the bottlenecks that we are seeing in different border stations. Unfortunately, a number of customs officers have been infected by COVID-19, and we have also lost a number of staff in East and Southern Africa from customs. Due to privacy reasons, I'm not able to reveal the countries or the names where we have lost a number of staff. But again, some years ago, the WCO started customs response, say to terrorism, and 2 years ago, we started issues of just having customs quickly responding. But we saw in our region a lot of reactive measures taking place, guided by the national government, where we did not have PPEs, personal protective equipment, and we had people getting infected and an entire office being closed without measures being put on the side to ensure continuity. Nevertheless, the good news is that things have continued to stabilize over time. One big challenge has been IT connectivity and the IT security protocols that have restricted working from home. You realize that a number of customs administrations allowed their customs staff to work from home. Nevertheless, their computers and their machines or gadgets may not have been, may have restricting working workabilities, so to say. What we must, however, note as we talk about borders, that it is difficult to work from home in our borders. And so we probably need to find newer ways, as I'll be talking about shortly regarding working at our borders. But we have had thinner staff levels at the borders, sometimes thin to the extent that backlog has been caused. And it's also been difficult to enforce social distancing for frontline workers at different border points. So that said, I'll move to my next slide on recommendations, some of the things that we are suggesting that can be done. The WCO has recently spoken about emerging technologies, which in some areas we also call exponential technologies. And our recommendation is that it's important that the private sector and customs administration realize the need to fast track the utilization of exponential technologies, things like blockchains. We already have certain countries in Asia that are using drones for verification of goods. So we realize that when we use these exponential technologies, depending on what we are doing, we are going to make it easier. When you use 3D printing in photography and in analysis of goods, these are going to help us, not just in light of the pandemic, but in increasing the levels of efficiency. I don't have to explain intelligent data management. The good news is we have noticed that most of our member administrations are taking issues of data management seriously, and the WCO has offered support to the region. We normally get this kind of support coordinated by our regional development manager, Patrick, who is here, in assisting us in developing the data frameworks for each member administrations. So we believe that intelligent data management will be faster, will be efficient, and will provide faster and more effective analysis regarding customs operations. But aside from that, it's important that we model customs procedures and operations. Most of us have already gone paperless. We only have 2 countries in the region, specifically South Sudan and Somalia, that are still using paper a lot. But we also have a lot of use of paper in Djibouti, Eritrea, Ethiopia, and to a small extent, Burundi. So we believe that paperlessness also increases contactlessness. I sort of put that word knowing that it doesn't exist, but to help us realize that the less contact that is there between customs on the border, on the border stations, the better it is for the other border agencies and the people using the borders, especially the private sector. So if people can leverage on a single window, which is what we are talking about, to ensure that there is a specific location where goods are lodged, and all the government, the partner government agencies at the borders work through that, it will help in remodeling the operations of customs. We still have many customs authorities that are calling on us to pay revenue physically, either in the banks, etc. but I can give an example of Kenya where you don't have to go to the bank. You recall that Kenya is the founder of the mobile money transfers globally. And so it has developed so much to the point Kenya Revenue Authority, for instance, doesn't have to see their people go to the bank. You can withdraw your money on your mobile phone from the bank and pay your taxes or your revenue, whatever amount it is, up to $3,000. I think it's important to note that you can pay up to $3,000 through your phone, and it is now free. What the government of Kenya, I'm giving this not because we are based in Kenya, but as best practice, what the government of Kenya did was that they removed all the bank charges for any bank transfers, especially those done through the mobile phones. So you can pay your, so it means the SMEs and all the small scale traders can execute all these without necessarily going to the bank. They are also accepting the RTGSs that may have been presented physically, though there are banks that are sending RTGSs and doing everything online. So if we do these in revenue collection, it will help a long way. The example I could give, I've forgotten the country, but one of the countries most affected by Ebola in West Africa had this challenge of digitization of revenue. And when they did that, there were low contacts, and it helped in improving in revenue collections. I don't have to talk a lot about the policies and procedures or the adherence to the COVID guidelines. And finally, my next slide, I'm just going to talk about the possible gains from the COVID-19 pandemic. One of our biggest gainers is ICT. So customs in ICT, we are hearing that most financial years for East and Southern Africa begin in July to March. We have other countries, I think South Africa, whose financial years begin in October, and others begin, I think, in April. So we are seeing increased budget for ICT departments in revenue administrations. We are seeing more organizations and every day more authorities adapting to remote working. And remote working may not necessarily mean working from home. You can be in a border and you do not have to be in touch with the trader who wants to cross the borders. We have seen smart borders developed in other places where a number plate of the truck carrying the goods is detected, say, from the port, and every place, every border station it passes, the picture of the number plate is taken. Remember, these goods are under electronic seals, so it's not easy to steal them because there's also rapid response units. And so as we make our borders smart, then we are also looking at issues of smart gates. We are also looking at issues of smart cargo handling, smart document processing, etc. So ladies and gentlemen, by and large, that is my presentation. My next slide just gives my contacts for those who would want to see them. But SAAFF and us are always more than happy to share these with you as you need them. Thank you, Juanita, and thank you for your attention, everyone.
Yeah, thank you, Larry. One thing is very important. You make sure that we do the capacity building from the customs administrative point of view. And I think what's quite optimistic or innovative is that we're really looking at new technology and that we want to make sure that our borders work. And apart from that, you're very innovative. You develop new words, and we will follow your your guidance on that, contactless. So Patrick, maybe you can, from a technical advisor from Brussels, give us some input on the WCO. What are they looking at in maybe in the next 2 months or 3 months? Thank you.
Thank you, Juanita. And good morning, colleagues, once again. I think Larry has set the scene well for the region, and so it will help me also to pick on some very practical issues whilst I try to discuss this topic, a very relevant topic at this state of play. But I would like us to immediately remind ourselves of the 2019 theme that the WCO selected. It talks about smart borders for seamless trade, travel, and transport. And the WCO specifically chose this theme as a way of showing its commitment to promoting the transformation of national frontiers into smart borders. What it means is that these borders will now be able to provide swift and smooth cross-border movement of goods, people, and the means of transport. And it also positioned customs administrations in the pivotal role of this particular agenda. So by smart borders, the theme envisions cross-border environment where customs working with other cross-border agencies will provide processes and procedures that will ensure security, that are secure, that these processes are measurable, sometimes based on even self-evaluation. They are automated. They are based on risk management decisions, and then technology-led. And in all this, they will provide an enabling environment for the global chain and economic growth as well. The scenario then was based on a positive outlook, a global outlook, where it was expected that the number of passenger travels and the volume of cross-border trade would even grow exponentially. Then a year after, the world is now faced with a COVID-19 pandemic, with unprecedented health crisis that has evolved into global economic crisis with serious socioeconomic impact. So how does this theme play now? Is it that because a positive outlook has changed, becomes irrelevant? No, it is even more relevant now to endear towards urgent transformation of frontiers into smart borders. Because this is the time that customs is asked to play a very critical role to continue to ensure smooth facilitation of not only relief and humanitarian goods, but goods in general, in order to help minimize the overall impact of the pandemic on human lives, societies, and the economy as well. In doing so, from the smart perspective, customs administrations are strongly urged to establish coordinated and proactive approaches with all concerned agencies to ensure the integrity and continued facilitation of global supply chains. Customs administrations are therefore encouraged to explore more in the realm of technology to find solutions. This is the whole idea that the WCO tried to promote, realizing that the emerging technologies, new technologies, and that they present opportunity for customs to re-engineer business processes whilst applying these new technologies to work more efficiently. So the mandate is still there, but the agency is very real now. It is not noticeable within the ESA region that all customs administrations have been impacted by the pandemic. And the visible things that we can recall is the adjustments made in a number of work areas, particularly to enhance protection of frontline officers, adjusting work hours and shifts to comply with containment measures, and reprioritizing workflow processes and procedures to minimize the negative effect of the pandemic on the supply chain. Hence, adapting to the guiding principles of smart borders as stated will not only keep customs administrations and other border agencies in readiness for the initial response mechanisms to disaster, but also keep them resilient to support the recovery phase of disasters, which is very critical to business continuation and economic recovery. By staying smart, customs administrations in the ESA region will ultimately be ready and prepared to even manage any future situations comparable to the COVID-19 pandemic. So we're looking at more of a sustainable way to deal with such a situation. I can only reassure you that the WCO is continuously working in this area and developing several instruments and tools to assist customs administrations in that regard. And the innumerable instruments and tools that I can always provide you through the links as well. What makes our discussion today also even more complete is matching these national and regional efforts to achieve smart borders with the concept of single window as well. And it makes it so relevant and complete, because we all know that many businesses in the region and around the world, including even SMEs, have adapted to the pandemic by moving to e-commerce much faster than they had planned. While businesses have been saved through this demonstrated capacity of e-commerce, the sudden shift actually presents an urgent calling to all, but from the perspective of customs, to provide the critical building blocks for the growth of e-commerce on the African continent. And ultimately, it is time for paperless customs and the whole digitalization of trade through a single window as well. Indeed, single window implementation is known to play a very pivotal role in digitalization of all national business processes, especially nationwide business processes to facilitate cross-border trade. And it also has a very great impact on how government interacts with other stakeholders, the private sector, as well as its citizens. So this single window has very huge potential in consolidating all efforts that will be made in the area of smart borders as well. From the WCO, we have gathered evidence that show that WCO members with mature single window environment, where digital solutions for interactions and processing with relevant stakeholders were to a greater degree better placed, they have had smoother processing to help even other countries during this pandemic. So the level of maturity of the single window environment actually also plays a very critical role. What the pandemic has done is actually then to bring some positive impact to bear on long-term planning for national digitalization policies and all that. We see governments like businesses and other people, they are all finding technological solutions for all activities, including trade, e-commerce, as I mentioned. Governments are refreshing their national IT projects and drafting new ones. And in all, they are looking for really innovative ways to confront the COVID. So customs administrations have a key role in the implementation and operation of this single window system, and must take necessary steps to seek assistance and do so very well. I will not try to go into the technicalities of single windows because I know there are more experienced practitioners on this platform also. But the WCO emphasizes cross-border regulatory single window and explains it as a facility which governs the regulatory aspects of cross-border flows of traded goods, cargo, transport equipment, means of transport and crew. And the whole focus is all about how cross-border regulatory agencies interface with trade. So that the government agencies are seen on one side, and then they are able to work with the needs, looking through the spectacle of traders, what trade needs, in order to ensure that ultimately they provide simplified solutions as well. And within the context of the UN Center for Trade Facilitation and Electronic Business, the recommendations, the WCO has also even come up with some unofficial definition of what a single window environment is. And here I will quote it as a cross-border intelligent facility that allows parties involved in trade and transport to lodge standardized information, mainly electronic, with a single entry point to fulfill all import, export, and transit related regulatory requirements. And here the emphasis on the intelligent facility is that apart from allowing the single point entry and then the electronic environment, it's a vehicle for providing shared services to all users. And so it allows for some intelligent interaction as well. From the perspective of the WCO, and enhanced cooperation of national single windows on even a regional level can result into regional single windows and prove to be an excellent tool for the continental free trade area implementation across regs. We can also look at the regional single window that may leverage on untapped potential of national and regional economies and facilitate further commercial transactions by multimodal transportation. What I would say is that the WCO as an international organization is well placed to provide leadership and coordination for smart border and single window initiatives undertaken by its members, and always ready to support the region in this particular cause. And the rules that the WCO will always adopt, it will be through standard setting, providing capacity building, and then through cooperation as well. So it's a great opportunity for me to really join in this discussion, and then I'm looking forward to further interactions on this. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Patrick. Thank you very much. The next one, I hope Valentina is going to challenge you because she's from private sector and she is, for the audience, she's the first one elected from Africa to sit on the board of the ICC. So that's a huge achievement. I think we're very proud of you, Valentina. So I hope you can challenge the WCO team a little bit and ask them why are we not working now in single window and border and integrated regional borders. But hopefully, I think the pandemic actually showed us that we need to work together. So over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Juanita. And thank you, colleagues, and thank you, participants. It really is a pleasure to share some of the lessons learned from the pandemic on areas that we've been working with. So you have my slides up on the screen. As we all know, the ultimate objective of smart borders and single windows is really to reduce the time and cost of doing international trade business. And this is where government and private sector really must work together, because most of the regulatory facilities are provided by government with the business conducted by private sector. And therefore that stakeholder collaboration is really important and even more critical in the pandemic times that we find ourselves. In July, the ICC, together with WTO, TFAF, and Global Alliance, conducted a survey on the COVID-19 crisis and trade facilitation. Larry shared some of the real challenges that are happening in the East and South Africa region. But some of the highlights from that July survey was that over 95 countries have implemented restriction and banning measures on export of some critical goods. Now, whereas these might be temporary non-tariff barriers introduced legitimately, it is important that we're all very deliberate in our programs to ensure that we mitigate the risk of these measures becoming permanent and established in our supply chains. Another outcome of the survey was almost all trade procedures have since become cumbersome, particularly in the area of testing and inspections. And these are on critical items of medical supplies, which sometimes are really needed in timely manner for critical areas in life or death situations. Therefore, having these regimes come in needs to be balanced with health and safety as well as the critical needs. Another area which was highlighted was the flow of transit goods to landlord countries. Now, these are all non-tariff barrier measures that we see slowly seeping into our supply chains. And as I mentioned earlier, whereas these are immediate challenges that need mitigating, we all need to work to ensure that the agreements that are put in place, the standards that are put in place, rapidly find solutions to ensure that we can get rid of these non-tariff barriers and look at the smooth movement of trade once again. Now, what have we learned from all these challenges, which Larry went through, and as well as the survey highlighted? And I'd ask everyone to go onto the ICC website to look at the survey, because it dives deep into the particular procedures and processes that have been negatively impacted. Now, these challenges clearly show that contingency planning and disaster recovery is no longer a hidden clause that is needed in agreements or in programs. But these must be robust and timely, because as we find it in these times, it's not just about the movement of goods, but it's also about life-saving goods. Also, as Larry mentioned, there is now the added balancing act of balancing health and safety matters such as physical distancing with trade facilitation, in addition to the already balancing act of trade facilitation and revenue collection that we find customs administrations faced with. So there is an added challenge, and this adds to all the, we need to ensure that nations and strategies are deliberate in ensuring that private sector can go about their duties while government regulates the necessary areas, but without putting burdensome processes in place that impedes movement of goods. Digitization and access to timely trade information seems to be those critical components that are needed to ensure that business can be conducted anytime, any place, anywhere. And today we learned a new word in the contactlessness environment as well. So it is imperative that we look at those digital aspects, trade information, how creative can we be with sharing trade information? Because we found that in the last few months, information was changing by the second, by the minute, by the hour. How do we ensure that this information is disseminated to the people who need it to ensure that we don't artificially stifle the movement of goods? And these are some of the measures that we'll have to work with to find out what our national infrastructures are, what the regional infrastructures are, and what solutions we can quickly put in place whilst we work towards the ultimate vision of creating a harmonized supply chain within and also with the trading partners. So with talking about digitization and trade information, we looked at some of the areas, some of the components that are relevant to the challenges that are being faced. If you look at pre-arrival processing, this is really now critical because there are now finite resources, there are physical distancing measures in place, and therefore finite resources are still managing the critical items that are coming in. And having access to data before the goods actually arrive means that the regulatory agencies who need to ensure that goods coming in are safe and sound for consumption can do their work before the physical arrival of goods at the ports, ensuring that we ease the flow of traffic in the spaces that we have for ports, container management, etc. Now, you cannot have pre-arrival processing when we don't have a robust national risk management system. And this is a national risk management system from a regulatory point of view, not just customs. So ensuring that risk profiles are managed and treated by all the necessary agencies. So phytosanitary agencies, standards authority, food and drug need to ensure they come together to manage the national risk registers to ensure that goods before their arrival we have visibility in the country of what is arriving, what needs to even be stopped before coming in, what needs to be treated, who needs to treat it. And that's where joint inspections and coordinated inspections also come in place. So having tools even before their arrival, coordinating these regulatory agencies is really key. It also brings to bear the regime of trusted trader, the authorized economic operators, AEOs. If you do have a list of trusted traders in your database, then certainly what one can do is expedite the movement of those compliant goods and work on post-clearance audit facilities that can check them, but ensuring that we decrease the time and cost of moving those goods across by removing those goods that belong to the trusted traders and leaving the space for the traffic to manage and to mitigate the risk of those non-compliant trades at the physical sites. Also bearing in mind that the customs officers and other agencies who may have to work from home or may have to have physical distancing measures in place means that that physical space is no longer fit for purpose because things need to be spaced out in such a way that health and safety is complied with. Also, that brings to the fore the regional single window programs. Because, as I mentioned, landlocked countries faced a stifling of trade flows into critical areas. How do we create free flow of goods and free flow of information to ensure that whilst national priorities are being managed, we do not clog up or close up critical paths that are needed for landlord countries to receive their goods from the coastal borders. Now, we cannot realize the maximum benefits of all these digitization programs without the physical infrastructure being in place. We need to make sure that telecoms infrastructure are sound, the ports facilities for container management and movement of goods and people are sound, and then the road networks are sound so that we don't have road barriers and bottlenecks along the lines of moving the goods once they arrive at the ports. So these are some of the tools from the compendium that can be looked at as a matter of priority. And these are some of the tools that have helped those mature economies that had mature single windows or mature systems. And these are those areas that have actually yielded benefits. And it's no longer a nice to have, but critical that some of these tools are put in place to ensure that not only do we move goods across, but then we save lives. So where do we go from here? Priorities need to be put in place, and these have to be specific to every country and every region. And it was good to hear of the works in ESA, in ESA, where only a few countries are yet to go paperless. That is the foundation that is needed. So it's a call to action to review national trade facilitation strategies to ensure that the priorities are put in place and blueprints are created for the very countries that are developing those, not a copy and paste, but blueprints that suit the priorities of the nation and systems that have already been put in place. And also implementation roadmaps to ensure that we rapidly realize value from some of the low-hanging fruits whilst we work towards the vision. As we know, the WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement was ratified with countries putting in their national priorities. So this is a time to dust those and not have those as documents, but having them as work in progress and aligning the national strategies and blueprints to these trade facilitation agreement priorities. Now, with all this is information and data. The free flow of information and data closely aligned with the movement of the physical goods. Now, the only way you can exchange data nationally, that is internally, nationally, and across borders, is ensuring that you have interoperability of systems and you have harmonized data sets. And that is where this WCO data model is really key. It is important that whatever systems are being put in place are based on the WCO data model, the latest version of the WCO data models, so that when you quickly or rapidly need to integrate systems within the countries or across the borders, they can already, the handshake and the system speaking can already be in place. So I think I'd end by saying that priority and planning is really key. And to achieve all these measures, we need to rapidly ensure that these tools are in place, because there is a long haul ahead of economic recovery of economies. And therefore, having these foundations in place would make sure that countries can bounce back quickly. And so I would end by saying that if you don't know where you're going, then any road will do. It's therefore very important that we look at the visions, we look at our short-term plans, and ensure that we have a roadmap to get us there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Valentina. Thank you. I think what you highlighted to us is that the importance to have a roadmap. And I think what I can take from this also is, don't think we do copy and paste. We need to have a blueprint that can satisfy that country's need. Now, that's why I want to pick the next panelist, and that's William, that will tell us from the Africa point of view, is that what blueprint do they think will go for the African Union? Thank you, Willie.
Thank you for the opportunity. Good morning to you all. I'm sure it's morning or afternoon for others. I have done a PowerPoint presentation. I've got very few slides. And of course, I have observed that some of my customs colleagues have covered some of the issues which I intend covering, but I'll emphasize these points. The first one, I think, was Patrick. Thanks, you covered about the smart borders, which is my first slide, the smart borders. We can go on to the next slide. On the smart borders, we are all aware of the WCO theme, or rather, the WCO theme for 2019 was smart borders for seamless trade, travel, and transport. And when I was looking at it, I thought it was almost like a prophecy of what was to come. because we need smart borders for seamless trade, travel, and transport. And now that we are gathered in 2020, then we start wondering to what extent we have succeeded to have smart borders for seamless trade, travel, and transport. And the emphasis on this theme was on ensuring that swift and smooth cross-border movement of goods, people, and means of transport, recognizing the central role of customs. And the guiding principles were to make sure that when we talk of smart borders, we are talking of security, measurable performance, automation, risk management, and technology driven. And you can't also overlook the fact that there is need for re-engineering of business processes. So this theme covered January to December 2019. Ignore that 2020. It was a theme for January to December 2020. January to December 2019. Then let's now move on to the next slide, which is 2020. Coming from that theme of smart borders, we come to 2020, starting in January when the COVID pandemic started coming. And for 2020, the WCO came up with another theme, which involved customs fostering sustainability for its people, prosperity, and planet. And it was also looking at contribution of customs towards a sustainable future where social, economic, health, and environmental needs are at the heart of its action. And coming from a situation where we have been talking of smart borders, then came COVID-19. And what were the results? We can move on to the next slide. What have we seen? I'm glad Larry touched on this. In 2020, we saw border closures. Some of these border closures, some of them were well coordinated, whereby you have two sides of the border closing at the same time. But in certain instances, you would have one country closing and the other country not closing. So we found border closures. And this resulted in no movement of goods and people. In certain cases, you would have people getting to the other side of the border, wanting to move across. They are cleared on one side, but they cannot move onto the other side. This resulted in interruption to business. It had a serious impact on businesses, business closures, and cash flows. I'll touch a bit more on cash flows and revenues. So this is what we experienced in 2020. This is what we are experiencing. Some borders are now slowly opening, but in some places, the borders are largely closed. And in some countries, they have selectively chosen border posts which they want to open. But we still have a situation where business is not yet back to normal. And the movement of goods move with people, truck drivers move with goods, and you have a situation where the goods cannot move because the person driving the truck cannot proceed to the next country. So this is what we are experiencing in 2020. And what are the lessons that we have learned or that we are learning? The next slide. I think a key lesson which has come out both for governments and the private sector is the issue of business continuity plans. Others call them disaster recovery plans. How strong, how reliable are they? And how are they being used as a fallback. When you look at these business continuity plans or disaster recovery plans, I'm talking both for the private sector, they have their own plans, and even both for governments, for the public sector, they also have their plans. Were we able to rely on these continuity plans or disaster recovery plans? And a key lesson which also comes with that is very often when governments, including revenue authorities, including customs, when they come up with their business continuity plans, it's normally them saying, in the case of a disaster, this is what we are going to do. But a key lesson which has come up now is when these business continuity plans are being developed, there is a need to engage the beneficiaries of those services. They would have an input. They would have an input into the disaster recovery plan, which is there. Because one of the lessons which came up is you would have the public sector, government, national sectors, customs, revenue authorities, having their own business continuity plans or disaster recovery plans, for which the private sector never had an input. And that business continuity plan is supposed to be implemented with the private sector, which might not be equally prepared to be implementing or to partner in that continuity plan. So this has been a key lesson, that when we develop these continuity plans or disaster recovery plans, I think as a result of COVID, we have the reality that what we are planning can tomorrow turn out to be a reality. The other issue which comes up, a lesson learned, is the issue of automation. I think with the coming in of COVID, business has moved now into the mode of ICT. And one of the lessons which has come up is there is need for governments, there is need for the private sector, there is need for customs administrations to invest in ICT in the running of the businesses. Even countries at national level, there is need for countries to invest in ICT. Can you imagine when offices were closed, customs officers were supposed to operate from home, but from the comfort of their homes, how many of them could link up with their offices or with their clients? So the extent of ICT coverage in a country also had an effect. There were instances whereby customs officers would have to go to the office, visit the office, in order to have access to ICT. So one of the reasons which is coming up is there's need for investment in ICT, not only for businesses, not only for customs, but even at national level, because this is the way business is going now. There is going to be more of ICT-based business and more of e-commerce. So I think coming out of this is for our national governments, for our customs administrations, and even for our business sector to invest in this sector of ICT. Let's continue the next slide on lessons learned. Lessons learned. The revenue losses. Revenue losses for the private sector, the private companies. Business came to a halt, there was revenue losses. And for those who had no backup of ICT and no business continuity plans, it was just zero inflows of cash. There were also revenue losses for the governments. Revenue stopped coming, salaries were cut, affecting income tax. Borders were closed, affecting customs revenue. And when this happened, it had a fiscal and a macroeconomic effect on government. Government supposed to pay its own salaries, supposed to pay its own salaries to civil servants. In fact, for most companies, some companies even had to reduce the salaries of their workers by a fraction. They would cut. But you would rarely find government saying to civil servants, because you have worked 20 days, I'm going to give you 2/3 of your salary. So you had a situation whereby expenditure on governments actually increased because there were social issues. Some governments were giving people food. So there was more expenditure on government, but the flow of revenue was reduced. So one of the key lessons was the issue that revenue losses affected both governments and the private sector, and these revenue losses were incurred because some business relied mainly on manual way of doing business, and that manual system of doing business was gone. Then another element which came was the need for cooperation with other stakeholders. The coming in of COVID brought in a certain level of cooperation amongst stakeholders. All of a sudden, everyone realized that the Ministry of Health is a very important national asset because they took the lead. It was no longer the revenue guys who collect money, who have got the money, who could call the shots. It was now the Ministry of Health. And they could come and say, the office must close. Or they will tell you that someone here has been found is not very well and we are going to order the closure of the office. So the issue about cooperation became very important. National stakeholder cooperation, even at international levels. I mean, all of a sudden now, everyone realizes that there is a World Health Organization which is playing a very key role in this pandemic. So one of the elements which came was the need for cooperation with other stakeholders at national, regional, and international level. And I hope even when we pass through this season that we are going through, we would have learned to make sure that our level of cooperation as customs, as business, and as governments maintains that. Then another element which came was transportation of goods. Some countries relied purely on road, others on rail traffic for imports, others on air. And the level of effect were different. If you relied on one mode of transport on road, you could find that when the borders closed, that was it. And some airports managed to maintain operating. The rail sector managed at least to pass through the borders to their destination. And one lesson which came was there is need to come up with a multimodal system, transport system, with networks in the road, rail, and air, and those with the ship, with ports as well, so that you don't just rely on one. So these are basically the lessons which I thought were learned: the revenue losses, cooperation, reliance, business continuity, plans, and automation. I thank you very much.
Thank you, Willie. I must say, I think the audience or the tendency will agree with me. If we listen to you and the intellect that you share and all the lessons learned, we in Africa can look forward to a good tomorrow because you've got input, you work with the Customs Authority, Larry, and Trade, and thank you very much. I think what we will do now is that I put an agenda to have a comfort break, but I think we skip it. So if the audience allow me, Trudy will quickly speak, and then Jason, and then we will open for questions, if that's okay with you. I'm going to try to make sure that we finish at 10:30, so it's going to be a call on us, but I don't want you to be too long on the Zoom call, because I think we got a lot of complaints from the business recently that they get Zoom fatigue. So we don't want to do that. We want to make sure that we share good information and that we can live in a good dream for our country. So Trudy, if you can share us your views, and then Jason, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Juanita, and thank you very much, everyone. I'm just sharing my screen with you. I have a few slides, and in fact, I'm actually going to be covering some issues that have already been emphasized, but I would like to situate my contribution in a broader trade, regional integration, and governance perspective. So I think what COVID-19 has done is to serve as a push factor for us to consider the broader context of digitalization in our economies, digital trade, and then of course within the context of customs and border management and the broader trade facilitation value chain, what has already been achieved and what more we can do to expedite the adoption of digital solutions. And I think Valentina's point about the importance of these solutions for the private sector have to be very much part of that discourse. In other words, these can be used to drive efficiency and competitiveness gains, and therefore benefit the gains from trade more generally and contribute to the overall development outcomes from trade. I think, as Willie has also indicated, digitalization and digital transformation has become very part of our policy discourse and agenda at the African Union level, at the regional economic community level, and also at national levels. And of course, since all our eyes are on Geneva at the moment, as a new Director General will be elected fairly soon, and we have serious interests as African countries, we see the e-commerce agenda within the context of the Joint Sector Initiative negotiations, which started at the end of last year. This has to be factored in as well. But this discussion raises very important governance and capacity issues. And the capacity issues here, I would cast rather broadly to include some of the infrastructure issues that Valentina and others have mentioned. But when we take a look at infrastructure and infrastructure services in particular, transport, communication, financial services, for example, then we of necessity have to look at the trade and services agenda as well, and very importantly, the regulatory governance agenda. Services are by nature regulatory intensive, and issues such as harmonization of transport regulation has to be part of this conversation. Harmonization of regulations around, for example, cyber protection, data storage, access to data protocols, and so on, are pushing us in the direction of digital governance that we have perhaps not all considered in the broad context of our trade and development agenda. I would also like to raise the issue around operational matters. Very important when we do conclude agreements, and of course, trade emphasizes the nature of cross-border cooperation, but also emphasizes that there are jurisdictional boundaries. We have to factor into that discussion operational matters, because officials do have some discretion. Therefore, the implementation aspects of the instruments that we do conclude and the cooperation manuals and so on, they have to be implemented by officials who are able to exercise some discretion. Some may still say we're more comfortable with paper solutions. So this is really important. Just linking that back to infrastructure and governance issues, Of course, all of this discussion requires that we focus on the essential priorities of energy security and connectivity. I think all of our speakers so far have mentioned these. So there's a broad infrastructure and connectivity ecosystem which will underpin our capacity and ability to adopt digital trade solutions, and specifically smart borders and associated customs and border management issues. As I've mentioned, the role of services is absolutely critical in the broader trade facilitation value chain. If we come back to Africa's regional integration model, I think at this stage we must recognize that we do not have supranationality, and we've seen some of the limitations of the model as member states have very legitimately taken specific measures to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic, to curb the spread of the virus. They are entitled to do so. They are sovereign member states, and all trade agreements make provision for the adoption of extraordinary measures in times of emergency, such as we're experiencing. However, if we take a look at the initiatives at regional economic community level, for example, they come in the form of guidelines and in treaties to cooperate. They are not binding commitments, hence they're not enforceable at national level. And that means that we also have to keep in mind that there are gaps in our governance architecture in some of our regional economic communities. SADC at the moment does not have a functional tribunal. So this focus here, I think, and I'm going to skip over the slide, it really takes a look at what happens at national level in the context of crises, disasters, pandemics. And I think the lessons we're taking now are particularly important because, of course, COVID-19 is not the last disaster or emergency that we will see. They may come in the form of climate disasters, they may come in the form of other pandemics. And what we're learning now should become institutionalized and systemic for future responses. Just to keep in mind that during a pandemic, during a state of emergency or disaster, the rule of law is not suspended. So judicial review is possible. And in the case of South Africa, we've seen a number of cases come before our courts. This is, of course, in the national context. What we do have to keep in mind is that there are some regional courts where cases can also be brought. So there is, in fact, the opportunity to test and to contest some of the measures that member states may have undertaken. If one takes a look at the national measures and the regional impact, I think the fact that so many of our speakers have indicated, when we take a look at a border, it has two sides. And unilateral measures of necessity impact the other side of the border. But given the contiguous nature of our countries in East and Southern Africa and across the continent as a whole, and the nature of our transport routes and corridors, of course, the closure of a border by an entry point into a sub-region, such as South Africa, such as Tanzania, Kenya, and so on, will of necessity have a much broader impact across a number of bordering countries as goods have to transit through to their final destination. Just coming back again to the regional responses, I think there are some extremely important lessons that we are learning. And that is that digital solutions can work. But digital solutions in the form of e-certificates, for example, whether they relate to rules of origin or to standards, whatever it might be, if they are issued and used by one nation state, for them to work in a trade context, they have to be accepted by the other member states. So it requires of necessity regional integration, cooperation, and a legal basis for accepting national certificates that may be issued in electronic form now. So I think these are really important to keep in mind. The lessons specifically from COVID, if I may just draw some of those through in the discussion. First of all, as we have mentioned, is the interconnectedness of the continent. I think Africa remains fragmented, and therefore effective functioning borders, effective functioning cross-border transport networks, multimodal transport networks are extremely important for Africa's future. This is important for the African Continental Free Trade Area, for the regional economic communities, but also for the individual member states. If we take a look at the implementation capacity required for digital solutions to work, for smart borders to work, then of course we have to focus also on domestic governance and capacity issues. At some point during the pandemic, for example, South Africa's International Trade Administration Commission had a note on their website indicating that an export permit could take 10 days to process. During a pandemic, when essential goods, pharmaceutical products, food products, have to move across borders, to wait 10 days for a permit is an extremely long time. If we add to that time in transit, time at the border posts, then in fact, this is not good enough. My last contribution is coming back to services and trade facilitation more generally. And I think this is absolutely critical because we don't often bring the trade and services discussion into the trade facilitation arena. And I think this is absolutely critical. If we look at transport, financial, communication services, as I've mentioned, the regulatory frameworks for those infrastructure services are absolutely critical to efficient cross-border trade. And this means that we have to take a look not only at regulatory cooperation across borders, but harmonization may be absolutely essential. And when it comes to digital infrastructure, and it comes to areas such as fiber cables and so on, and the governance around access to the data which is transmitted via cables, then these are new areas of regulation and governance that we have to look at very, very carefully. If we take a look at interagency cooperation, this has both a national dimension, but also a cross-border dimension. And in many countries, we do not have a legal basis for interagency cooperation. And that will be absolutely essential if we are going to take a look at, for example, distributed ledger technologies, the blockchains, which are really the broader concept around single windows for access to databases and for use of personal information and so on. So there's a really important new area of governance that needs to be developed for effective access to some of the important information which is essential for trade facilitation. The bigger picture developments, the important link between the trade and goods agenda, trade facilitation, customs, border management, transit, and e-commerce. E-commerce now very much also on the AFCFTA agenda, but at the end of the day, having an efficient e-commerce platform is only one requirement. Our goods still have to cross borders. So the traditional trade and goods agenda around trade facilitation, customs and border management is absolutely essential. Without that, e-commerce will not succeed. So the interconnections between areas of governance in the broader trade agenda are absolutely essential. To conclude, on a governance note, governance for the digital economy, for smart border management, single windows, cybersecurity, protection of personal information, data storage and access. These are absolutely essential. They're important at the national level, but they have to be addressed at a regional and continental level as well. There are important capacity deficits and governance gaps that still exist, and we have to address those to make sure that the digital solutions we're looking at to make our borders work more efficiently, to make our trade facilitation value chain work more effectively, can actually deliver to make trade support development for Africa. Thank you.
Thank you, Trudy. Thank you very much. I think you're quite right. Africa is very fragmented and we need to look at all these lessons learned to see how we can apply it. So the last one, Jason, you're not the least important. I think we want to listen to hear what DHL is saying, because you're probably in cargo movement and e-commerce, and you can share some valuable information with us. Thank you.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes, clear.
Okay,
thank you.
Perfect. And can you see my screen?
Yes, as well. Thank you.
Perfect. So we've had quite a lot of fun over the past 4 months at DHL. It's been a real challenge, but a lot of dialogue. Juanita, Trudy, all of the key private sector participants have been really good at sharing information, setting up working groups, and most importantly, sharing lessons learned, best practices, and how do we move forward, given that, as Trudy mentioned, this is not going to be the first type of situation that we're probably going to see a rise of this magnitude or nature going forward. And we're going to probably see the situation as it currently is, especially within the African context, for probably another at least 6 months, where there's going to be significant disruption to trade and services. So we've done quite a bit of investigation in terms of lessons learned across the Africa region. DHL, as some of you may know, operate in all 51 sub-Saharan African countries. We also have a fleet of 15 aircraft that we also utilized, which gave us a bit of insight into, for example, the regulatory challenges and COVID impact on our aviation sector. So it's been a fairly interesting 3 to 4 months, and we're starting now to really start settling into what I'll call the new norm, or what we all call the new norm. I'm going to run through some slides. I'm not going to try and do death by PowerPoint, because I think PowerPoint decks have been created, recreated, and published en masse over the last 4 months. I'm going to try and run through it very quickly. I know that we're mindful of time. As always, just a regulatory disclaimer that this is information and our views on the situation. So basically, information, it's changed our lives in ways that I don't think anybody envisaged it. I was saying to my wife last night how we were all sitting in Cape Town at Christmas, and nobody saw what was coming. Nobody even had a figment of their imagination aligned to what was to happen over the next 6 months. It's re-emphasized, COVID, the fundamental importance of global trade. What we've also seen is, very importantly, and I love reading or listening to the presentations, because it very much aligned with my views, DHL views and thoughts, and what we see as critical within the region in terms of trade development, digitalization. And I said this after the last webinar, Trudy, that you facilitated, in so much as that everybody within the private sector is very much aligned to the thoughts, the discussions, and the points. And there is very much a strong agreement on what some of the critical issues are and critical takeaways and actions that are needed. So transparent and consistent regulatory frameworks were one of the things that we strongly support and want to see developed. And of course, the AFCFTA and the TFA certainly offer a very good framework for us within the SSA context to develop trade and smart border, etc. Okay, so some of the key observations. So the AFCFTA, as I've just mentioned, if it's rapidly implemented, as you can see, Mr. Karingi from the Regional Integration and Trade Division at the ECA said, it would hasten the recovery from COVID-19. So certainly the free trade agreements, I think, are an important element of any discussions. What we saw during COVID was very rapid rollout of regulations, governing measures, and there was little private sector consultation. I asked all of my 51 countries before the regulations were rolled out how much interaction was there. unfortunately, the situations were arising so rapidly that there wasn't really much of an opportunity to consult. But we, in hindsight, we think more private sector involvement and dialogue prior to the implementation of regulations are important. And especially making sure that we have the infrastructure and capabilities to manage the regulatory changes. In the one case, on the one country where there was a implemented lockdown, nobody could get onto the online portal to apply for essential services permits. And it took about 3 or 4 days before that particular website came back up. We also found countries were erring on the side of caution, rightfully so, in that nobody knew how this pandemic was going to evolve. And there, of course, is the risk at the moment that we're going to see protectionist policies re-established and continued. And that's a risk that we've got to keep in the back of our minds could continue in terms of the next 6 to 12 months. In terms of other observations, so we did see some reprieve from customs, and I think some of the other presenters mentioned it as well. So easing of bonds, simplified clearances, stronger focus on digitalization in some countries, and reduction in duties and taxes on, for example, COVID essential items. We also have already had discussed in the presentations the border measures. We were lucky insofar as that the cargo flights were still allowed to operate, and we were able to gain, within the logistics industry, essential services status in many of the countries, allowing us to continue, in part, our supply chains and continue to ensure the flow of goods. We still are seeing, unfortunately, a number of physical inspections still continuing, and a number of stops where there is a physical interaction requirement. So that's a bit of an interesting one, because we would have thought this would have been the ideal opportunity for physical interaction and inspections to be reduced, and to demonstrate the importance and power of risk profiling versus the manual physical approach based to customs clearance. And then, of course, we've seen daily changes in the regulations that were published on a daily basis. That seems to have stabilized. We've seen a reduction in the number of new directives that have come out. Often little advance notice of the regulatory changes. I think for a lot of us in South Africa, as a sort of a bit of humor, is the fact that the alcohol regulations were changed on a Sunday night with very little notice. Nobody, for example, could stock up. And it was just an example of how quickly the regulations can change. You go from a situation one evening to a change in the situation the next morning. We often find sometimes that guidance were sometimes lacking in clearly defining the regulations, and there was insufficient clarity, which led to ambiguity in terms of, for example, roadblocks. When you went through a roadblock, the interpretation by security police or the army in some cases and countries was that they didn't fully understand the intent of the regulations, and the guidance notes were not sufficiently worded to remove that ambiguity. There was a global lack of coordination, which is now being improved substantially. And then I've talked about the lack of clarity on the defining standards regarding import and export controls. And in some countries, there was, for example, regulatory restrictions on masks, but there were no defining standards as what type of a face mask, for example, would be an acceptable import. So what we now need to be doing, and this clearly, I think, stood out in all the presentations and in prior seminars that we've done, integrate the lessons that we've learned, make necessitated adjustments to operating models within the customs environment, particularly to long-term sustainable modernized customs processes. Now is an ideal opportunity for countries to learn that their risk mitigation through modernization is not as fraught with as much risk as they may have thought. And I think the COVID-19 is an ideal opportunity to leverage these lessons learned and to integrate them into our future models and plans. So some of the other ones for smart borders, for example, priority lanes for freight transport at the borders. That's particularly important. It worked really well in Europe. Expedite critical goods, which we did see in many countries where they were trying to expedite. But we've also seen, at the same time as we've seen expedited critical goods, we've also seen regulatory constraints blocking critical goods through undefined or non-defined standards, and the lack of a single window meant that you would clear it through one border management agency, then it would have to go to another border management agency, and then through to health, and there were 3, 4, 5 agencies involved with no coordinated single window approach. And that's really critical in terms of trying to harmonize how we clear and manage our supply chains during and after COVID. Tariff relief was evident in some countries, and in some countries, the tariff reliefs that were granted have now been revoked because there is enough local supplies available, for example. Very important for me, and this is my particularly pet focus, or not so much pet focus as priority focus within my role in lobbying for DHL and on behalf of the associations or industry bodies that I represent, risk management and pre-arrival processing. There's a lot of work going on. The GIZ is involved as well in terms of looking at how do we maximize the opportunities that pre-arrival and pre-departure processing presents to us in terms of risk profiling, and how do we streamline those processes to ease the cost of and timelines in doing business within the Africa region. We want to look at, we should be encouraging minimization of physical inspections, prioritization of AEO cargo, very important. If you've got AEO certified entities and traders, let them benefit from those AEO statuses. They've been certified, the risk is minimal, and that would certainly help to shift the congestion in some of the borders that we're seeing. Look at penalty and collection changes. I'm not going to go through that in detail. Digitalization and paperless filing came out in the other presentations. Absolutely a key focus area, and in fact I'm involved with a project now looking at digitization in 5 key African economies, and how do we use those as pilot countries to expand the digitalization process and enhance its opportunities. Extending deadlines for paper-based processes, it helps to social distance, and it helps to demonstrate that paper-based processes can be replaced by paperless trade and digitalization. We should look at suspension of access restrictions. We should ensure that the public sector should involve the private sector, as they're currently doing in many countries with future and current policy decision changes. Don't make these decisions in isolation or in a silo approach. Involve all the stakeholders. The private sector adds very valuable experience and best developed practice contributions. And we see ourselves as a stakeholder with the public sector in this process. And then, of course, the one that I'm passionate about, as I mentioned, fast-tracking and achieving the paperless customs agenda in Africa, and the recognition that digitalization is an integral part of a modernized customs environment. So thank you very much for the opportunity to present. It's very interesting, again, how all my content is very much aligned with the other presenters, and we all have the same agenda, desires, and the same focus. And that's where the strength lies, in that collaborative approach, in isolating out those key issues and key elements of the approach that are to be taken. Thank you, Juanita.
Thank you, Jason. Just from my side, I'm just going to give you all the slides we'll make available on our website, which is www, as I said in the beginning. You can pick it up on the webinar as well. And then I'm going to ask Larry to say a final thank you to all the panelists, our attendees. For me, it was actually great insight, and I think I shaped my dream of how Africa should look like much better, and it gets now legs, and it can be a real reality to live in. Thank you, Larry.
Thank you, Juanita. On behalf of the WCO, specifically the East and Southern Africa region, to say thank you first to Juanita. I know you asked me to say thank you to the panelists. Thank you for bringing us together always, and bridging the gap between customs and business. And Juanita, what comes to mind is that next time as we organize these, we probably need to invite the customs administrations to be fully part of it, and specifically to have 1 or 2 panelists who are from the directors generals or commissioners of customs from the region, and we will be more than happy to coordinate these with you, so that we also hear the view of government as opposed to the view of policy makers such as the WCO and us. So once again, to now say a special thank you to all the panelists, my brother Patrick, Valentina, to Willie, to Trudy, to Jason. I think the final words that Jason gave are the I would give, that we are in this together, and it's amazing how our presentations found congruence. So I think the winners here are the need to harmonize and to better coordinate, to enhance ICT, and to recognize that these are abnormal times, and abnormal times require abnormal ways of working. We cannot do the same thing. We cannot insist on wanting revenue the way it used to be, while people are losing jobs, businesses, rent is going down here and there. So in a special way, to just thank the panelists for all your nuggets of wisdom, the sharing of experiences and the best practices, and to wish everyone well, including those who are attending these and may not manage to talk today. Thank you, Juanita.
Thank you. Thank you all, and have a lovely day. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Bye.